In 1972, a housewife from Louisiana wrote a novel in her spare time. Her husband went to work, her kids went to school, and she sat down and wrote. No agent, no query letters, no algorithm telling her what was selling. She just wrote the thing that she wanted to read. And her publisher made a decision that changed publishing history. They didn't put it in bookstores. They put it in grocery store checkout lines because that's where women were. And they wanted women to find it. It sold millions of copies, and it launched the entire romance genre as we know it today. But the hero does something unforgivable to the heroine in chapter 1. That book is The Flame and the Flower by Kathleen E. Woodiwiss. And this year for our Ripped and Ravished book club, I read it chapter by chapter with my whole community. And we discussed this on the podcast, 2 chapters at a time, with my co-host Becky from the Too Stupid to Live podcast. And the responses that came back from the women in our community that were doing the read along with us, some were reading it for the first time, some who read it first 50 years ago. Seeing those responses changed how I understand not just this book, but why we read romance at all. And that's what this video is about. So a little context here if you're new. I'm Francesca from Under the Covers Book Blog, and every 2 months we're running something called the Ripped and Ravished Book Club, where we go back to the Bodice rippers, the vintage old school romances, the books that build the romance genre, and we read them with today's eyes, not to cancel them, not to defend them, but to understand them. So for The Flame and the Flower, we went really deep with this one. Becky and I did 5 podcast episodes discussing this book. We invited our community to read along and to write in their responses every single week. We got emails from women in their 20s that were reading this for the first time. We got emails from women in their 60s who first read it as teenagers, sneaking it off their mother's shelf. And we sat down with author Kate Baxter, who writes paranormal and urban fantasy, who read Woodiwiss at 16 and credits her as the reason that she became a writer. Now, by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why this book sold millions of copies, why it still makes people uncomfortable, and why one particular email from a reader stopped me cold and it made me rethink the whole thing. So let's start at the beginning. Now, here's what happens in The Flame and the Flower. Heather Simmons is 18 years old. She has no money, no family that wants her, and no options. Her aunt has treated her as a servant her entire life, and then she's sent to London with the promise of a job, and there everything falls apart within the first 24 hours. She ends up killing a man in self-defense. She runs, and she ends up on the docks. She's mistaken for a prostitute and brought aboard a ship to the captain. That captain is Brandon Birmingham. He is 35 years old, wealthy, powerful, and engaged to someone else, and he assaults her. He realizes partway through that she is not a prostitute, but he keeps going. And that is chapter 1. I cannot tell you how hard that was to read, and I do think we need to address something about how Woodiwiss writes that scene, because I do think it matters. Actually, let Becky tell you that, because I think she says it so much better in the podcast.
Nothing about her rape is like sexualized. Like it is sexual violence, but it really does emphasize this is violence. This isn't anything that's supposed to be remotely titillating or passionate. I'm just like, this is just dark and not romantic.
That choice to write it as violence and not passion is not nothing. I mean, it's 1972 when this was published, and for a book that was being sold at the grocery store checkout line, that is definitely a deliberate choice to open a book at that time like that. But then there is Brandon. So let's talk about him. I feel like he's the granddaddy of dark romance heroes, because I don't think you can get darker and more, I can't even say morally gray. That's like pitch black. Not morally gray, pitch black. And here's the thing about Heather that surprised me the most when I was reading this book. She is genuinely not okay. She does not brush this off. She does not magically recover because the plot needs her to recover. Like, she flinches. She's scared. And that is something that Becky caught really well early on.
She's definitely like written as a fully fledged like human being, having very human responses to this terrible situation she's in.
But what Woodiwiss did not give Heather together. And this is something that Becky and I kept coming back to across all 10 chapters, is an inner world. Those messy thoughts, the spiraling feelings, that is the thing that, in my opinion, makes modern romance feel like living inside someone else's head. You didn't really get that with this book.
So much of the joy of reading romance is just like living in these characters' minds, and we're not seeing that as much.
And really what made us stranger was this. We're totally in the dark right now with what any of them feel. I mean, I actually feel like we know more how he feels than how Heather feels. Remember, this is a book written for women, about a woman, published as a revolution in women's storytelling, and we are in the hero's head more than the heroines, which was kind of crazy. But on a weird note, also something that surprised me and we had to count was the amount of baths. So I need to talk about the baths because across 10 chapters and 5 podcast episodes, every single reader email that we received, and obviously we were commenting on the podcast, the baths kept coming up. Our reader, Kim, actually was counting for us 16 baths just through chapter 8. 16 baths. The thing that I kept thinking about, because there's also a lot of, is bathing.
Yes. Oh my
there
God,
was
I wrote
so
that down.
much
So
bathing.
Much bathing.
$17.99?
Yeah.
Really? This much?
Exactly. I was like, is it common for husbands and wives to bathe each other?
This is the grooming episode.
I wrote
so
that down.
many baths.
I wrote that down. I wrote down more baths and just had an exclamation point. And I'm like, again.
I think there were
Oh,
at least 4 baths in 2 chapters. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was wild. I have never seen anything like that. And Becky also made an observation about the baths that I keep coming back to, actually, because it's not really just about like, oh, hee ha ha, there's a lot of baths, but maybe actually there's more to it than that.
The baths aren't even used to their full extent either. Because like, I can understand, okay, I don't know why I'm going here, but like, when I would give my niece a bath when she was a baby, like I always thought, this is fun, we're connecting. It wasn't about the bath, it was us connecting.
Yeah.
What's the point of the bath if we're just seeing them bathe? It's not about them bathing, it's about them connecting, and we're barely getting that.
I think that was a whole frustration with the middle of this book in one bath analogy. The ingredients for connection in this book are there, the moments are there, and then Brandon would open his mouth and says exactly the wrong thing, and we're back to square one. By page 318, and I need you to feel how far into this book 318 is.
Yeah.
There's been enough of this book for him to have a little bit of growth, and the only growth that he's had is the fact that he can accept that he has feelings for her. But no other growth. Zero other growth.
Yeah.
Zero other growth from our morally gray, pitch black granddaddy of dark romance. And here's where I actually want to stop, because everything I just said is true, and it is also only half of the story. That is Becky and my story. But when we opened up the Ripped and Ravished book club to community responses, we asked people to write in every week, and one email stopped me completely. Her name is Diane, and she's 62 years old. She was a teenager when this book was published. She grew up surrounded by women who were marching. The feminist movement was alive and loud, and the world was shifting around her. And she found the flame and the flower in a grocery store checkout line. And she wrote something that I want to read to you carefully, because I think it will reframe everything for you like it did for me. What I took from the book was the revelation that women could enjoy sex, and their pleasure was centered. Their pleasure was centered. For 1972, in a culture that was telling women that sex was just their duty, not their desire, not their right, not their story, this book actually said that your pleasure is real, it is valid, it is worth writing a whole novel about. But then Diane also said something else at the end of her email, and I've been sitting with that ever since, because after 5 podcast episodes of us discussing and talking about this book and how we were seeing it, this really made me shift how I was analyzing it and how I had talked about it up to that point. It wasn't about Brandon. It was about the Heather in all of us. That line right there, the Heather in all of us, I really want you to hold that idea for the rest of this video, because I think that was the key to understanding not just why this book mattered, but why it still does, and why the romance genre is so successful. Because Woodiwiss wasn't asking women to fall in love with Brandon. She was asking them to see Heather, a woman who had nothing, who was failed by everyone who was supposed to protect her, who went through something devastating and who was still standing, who still had desire and who still had a story worth telling. That was the revolution, not the forced seduction trope, not the rapey hero. The revolution was Heather getting to be the point of the story. So when we posted the chapter discussions and asked our community to write in, the other emails that came back were some of the most thoughtful writing about romance that I have personally ever read, because some of these women were reading this book for the first time, and some of them had first read it in the 1970s. And their responses told completely different stories about what this book is. For example, Cheyenne had been reading Woodiwiss from the time that she was 12 years old, and she talked about what the world actually looked like for women at the time this book was published. And she said something that reframes the whole darkness of this book for me. Violence against women was a fact of life in 1799. Reading a story where everyone was polite and genteel all the time, that was the real fiction. And we really have to say with that, the darkness in this book was not escapism from a dark world. For the women reading it in the 1970s, the dark world was real. They knew it, they were living it, and here was a book that looked at it directly and said, here's the part that mattered, and she still gets a story. And then there's something that Becky mentioned about what it must have felt like to find this book at a checkout line, to be a woman in 1972, buying everything your family needed for the week, and then seeing this sitting there waiting for you.
When you're seeing it in line at the checkout station in like the 1970s, you've just bought everything that you need for your family. This is a safe space. Mm-hmm. And to see it there, like, I imagine that someone being like, okay, we see you, like that acknowledgement of we see you and we see what you want and this is safe, no matter, despite this content. Like I imagine people felt very good about that and like finally felt, oh, I can be in touch with something that I felt like needed to be tamped down. It doesn't have to be anymore. Mm-hmm. And there's a beauty in that and a remarkable kind of revolution in that as well.
We see you. I think that's powerful. But I also want to be honest with you, because not everyone in the community landed in the same place. And I think that that's important too. We have Kim, for example, who has been reading romance since her preteen years and read this book for the first time in the late 80s and loved it and pushed back on what Becky and I were saying directly. She said, you cannot read a historical romance and apply today's societal rules. And she's right. She is completely right. You have to hold some of that context. You have to understand what 1799 meant for women's lives and what 1972 meant for women's lives before you can understand what the book is doing. So I'm not going to pretend that I read this without my 2026 brain, because I just couldn't. Neither could Becky. And I don't think you should have to do that either today. But I also think that Kim and Diane are saying the same thing from different angles, because Kim is asking us to respect the context and Diane is telling us what that context felt like. So both of them are right and holding both of those things at once. And I think that that is a really interesting place to read this book from. Woodiwiss made you sit with the damage for 8 chapters before she let you see the love. And that is not an accident, because women reading it in 1972 had been sitting with the damage mostly for their whole lives, and the book didn't ask them to forgive Brandon. It was asking them to see Heather. And I think that's why it really sold millions of copies. By the way, if you want to do a read along of this book, you can actually join the weekly emails for this particular discussion. And every week you'll get our 2-chapter discussion that you can follow along. So I'll leave a link for that in the description box below. But I also want to say that Becky and I went into this book knowing what we were getting into. We had done our research. We had read the articles. We knew that things were coming.
So we went in in like, you know, when like you're going to get a cavity filled, like you know you're gonna get a cavity filled and you like are prepared mentally. Like that's how I was doing it going in. I was like, it felt like I was like, honestly, like it felt like I was getting like an STD test or something of like, I know this is gonna be uncomfortable for a second.
I mean, fully prepared, or so we thought. But actually, here's what happens after The Flame and the Flower, because this book opens a door. Publishers finally realize that women will buy romance novels in massive numbers, and the Bodice Ripper era begins. An entire generation of women grows up reading these books, including a now published paranormal romance author named Kate Baxter, who also writes urban fantasy as Amanda Bonilla and romantic suspense as Mandy Baxter. And she picked up her first Woodiwiss at 16 off of her mother's shelf and never looked back. Now, Kate sat down with us for the Ripped and Ravished Book Club series, and the first thing that she said about Brandon Birmingham, I feel like Brandon is kind of like the granddaddy of dark romance, morally gray heroes. Like he's pretty pitch black, but it's pretty much the same guy, you know, like that we see now. It's just repackaged.
Yes.
He is, dare I say, scarier than a mafia don. Like I would feel safer with a crime lord now than with him back then.
I also think he is the granddaddy of the touch her and die trope.
Yes.
True, yes.
Because from the very beginning, he is ready to throw down with anybody that even looks at her wrong.
Every morally gray hero that you have ever completely lost your mind over, the possessive ones, the dangerous ones, the ones who would burn the world down for the heroine, they all really can trace back their line to Brandon Birmingham. Even the granddaddy of the touch her and die trope, which is absolutely true. That is in every possessive hero book that you have ever read. It is in every paranormal romance, in every dark romance. It really all started here. And then Kate also said something about why we should keep reading these books. Even the complicated ones like this one, that I think is genuinely important to think about.
If we don't read about this stuff, we'll forget about it.
Yes.
And so we have to remember this is the way things were because we don't want to backslide, right? So I think it's important to keep reading them. It's important to remember, oh, look how far we've come as a genre, as women, as readers, that our stories have progressed to this point.
And that is so important. Look how far we've come. Kate herself is evidence of that evolution because her journey as a reader went from reading Woodiwiss straight to Anne Rice. And that pipeline makes complete sense when you think about it, because what paranormal romance does is take that same intense, all-consuming, dangerous hero, and it puts him in a world where the author gets to invent the rules. You can have that dark, possessive, obsessive energy without being constrained by what 1799 actually meant for women's lives. But you get to build that world.
I went directly from Kathleen Woodiwiss to Anne Rice.
Oh.
I
no,
mean.
there was literally I went from one to the other. And then when I started reading Anne Rice, I was like, oh, like this is where it's at. Like this is, I still am. I adore an Anne Rice book. Like I will read anything she's written. I've read her erotica. I've read I just think she's so lush. Like the thing that I admired about her was her ability to write the scene and the scenery and the buildings and the descriptions. And that's something that I'm not as good at in my own writing. So I really admired that about her. And again, just the dark poetry of it all and the romantic side of that kind of paranormal world, like that seduced me into paranormal romance right off the bat.
And I can totally identify with everything that she just said, because that was also my experience with falling in love with anything paranormal. But then Kate also said something in our interview that I think is the clearest articulation of why this book, with everything complicated about it, still works, still resonates, and still sells.
There's a sea voyage and a handsome man, and he whisks her away from everything, and her life is in danger, and there's blackmail and intrigue and pregnancy, and just he picks her over everyone. And isn't that, at the end of the day, I think that's what everyone wants to know, is that you've been chosen over anyone.
And that's it. That right there, you've been chosen over anyone. That's the whole point of this book. That's the whole point of the romance genre. It's not about the forced seduction, the forced marriage, not the baths, not the granddaddy of dark romance. The main thing is our heroine, in this case, Heather, a woman who had nothing, who came from nothing, who had been failed by everyone, being chosen fully, completely over anyone else in the world. But now I want to come back to Diane for a second, because after everything, all 10 chapters and all 5 podcast discussions, including all the bath scenes and all the frustration and all the lack of growth, Diane's email does something that none of our podcast discussions quite managed to do. It tells you what this book was actually for. She was talking about what Woodiwiss did. Not what Brandon did, but what Woodiwiss did. She said the book did 2 things that were genuinely radical. First, it wrote women as the star of their own story, their desire, their experience, their inner world, front and center. And second, and this is the one that really gets me, is that it wrote that a woman could go through something devastating and still be a full, whole sexual human being. She could still experience pleasure. She could still fall in love. She could still have a story worth telling. And then I'm going to read you again Diane's last line because I think it's important. It wasn't about Brandon. It was about the Heather in all of us. The Heather in all of us. Women were not reading this book because they were glamorizing being assaulted or for the sexual content. They were not reading it because they thought a forced marriage was romantic. They were reading it because here was a woman who went through something devastating and she was still standing. She still had desire. She still had a full story to tell, and she was chosen. She got her happily ever after, and that was radical in 1972, and sometimes it can still be radical today. I definitely think that's why this book has never fully gone away, because there's always a reader finding it and they will wrestle with it the way Becky and I wrestle with it, the way our whole community really wrestle with it together, because that is the point, because it asks you to feel things, to analyze things, and to see things from different perspectives. How do we hold the complexity of where we came from? Because we don't have to love everything about this book. I don't think it's necessary. We don't have to defend Brandon. Absolutely not. We definitely don't need to defend all the bath scenes, but we do get to honor what this book did for the women who needed it and for the genre that grew from it. And honestly, for us, because without The Flame and the Flower, there is a real argument that the books that you and I love right now, they would not exist. Those dark heroes, the possessive love interest, the paranormal alphas, that touch or die trope, the idea that a woman's pleasure is worth centering in a story, the idea that a woman can go through the worst possible thing and still get a happily ever after, all of that traces back to a housewife in Louisiana writing in her spare time while her kids were at school. That's not nothing. But I've been rambling for a while, and there's a few things that I want to leave you with before I go. If you want the full conversation with Kate Baxter, the paranormal romance comeback, and her book, The Last True Vampire, all of that is in the podcast episode with her. I'm going to leave that link in the description. It was genuinely a fun conversation. Kate is definitely the real deal. And if you were part of the Ripped and Ravished book club, if you read along with us, if you sent in any emails, I just want to thank you. Honestly, what you wrote in made this whole series something that I am really proud of. Becky and I were both reading the emails, enjoying everything that was coming through, hearing your thoughts, and understanding things that we didn't even think about ourselves that made us see things in completely different ways. You definitely made this experience better. Also, if this conversation made you want to read The Flame and the Flower for yourself or reread it, we have a do it anytime version of the book club, so you can sign up and every week you get an email with the 2-chapter discussion delivered straight to you. You can read it at your own pace. You can reply to the email if you want to join in on the conversation as well. I will leave that link in the description box. And in the meantime, just let me know in the comments, have you read The Flame and the Flower? Are you a first-time reader, or did you come to this one back in the day? I genuinely want to know all about it. Also, one more thing, if you enjoy these kind of conversations about romance books, make sure you subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!